Everyone is telling you that the targeted strikes on Iran's leadership just neutralized their nuclear program and prevented a global meltdown.
Yeah.
What if I told you those exact strikes guaranteed the precise nightmare they were supposed to prevent?
Yeah, the gap between the headlines and the reality on the ground right now it's massive.
It really is. Today, we're looking at a stack of raw, highly classified strategic assessments regarding Operation Epic Fury from March 2026. Our mission for this deep dive is to expose the hidden systemic risks the mainstream media is completely blind to.
We are going to reveal why your wallet, your physical security, and frankly, the entire global order are about to face an unprecedented shockwave.
But before we jump in, I want to set some very clear ground rules for you, the listener. We are dealing with highly sensitive geopolitical actions involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran. We are strictly impartial here. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing any political viewpoints.
Right. Our sole job is to analyze the raw intelligence and show you what is actually happening beneath the surface. The goal isn't to tell you what to think about the conflict. It's to give you the data the media is actively missing so you can see the whole board.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's bypass the political theater and start with the immediate visceral fallout. The strikes happen, and instantly, Brent crude spikes 10 to 13%. It rockets past $82 a barrel.
Which is a massive jump.
Huge. But if you turn on the financial news, the mainstream assumption is aggressively reassuring. Analysts are on every network saying, don't panic, OPEC Plus just approved production increases. They'll pump more oil and smooth everything out.
And that is a fundamental, really dangerous illusion. The financial analysts are looking at spreadsheets, and they need to be looking at maps. It simply does not matter if OPEC Plus decides to pump more oil right now.
Because of the bottleneck.
Exactly. The issue is geography. 20 million barrels of oil a day, which is roughly 20% of total global consumption, are physically locked behind the Strait of Hormuz. The transit is completely paralyzed.
Major shipping operators haven't just slowed down, right? They have entirely suspended operations because the insurance premiums have just gone to the moon.
Right, because of the imminent threat of Iranian retaliation. So you have this immense spare capacity sitting in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq, but it's physically trapped.
It's like having a warehouse full of food, but the only bridge out of town is rigged with explosives.
That's a perfect way to put it. That is the reality on the water. And it has forced the oil market into a severe state of what we call backwardation.
Wait, backwardation's a pretty heavy finance term. Let's ground that for the listener. What does that actually look like for a buyer trying to secure oil today versus next month?
So imagine a scenario where sovereign nations and massive corporations are panic buying. In a normal market, oil for delivery 6 months from now costs a bit more than oil delivered today, just to account for storage and inflation.
Makes sense.
But in backwardation, the curve inverts entirely. Buyers are paying a massive, desperate premium for physical oil right this second because they believe the future supply chain is structurally broken. They are hoarding whatever is currently floating on the open ocean.
I want to pause on that for a second because we need to bring this macro data directly to you, the listener. What does a frozen Strait of Hormuz actually cost you?
The numbers are brutal.
They really are. If the strait is effectively closed for 30 days or more, these intelligence assessments project oil hitting $130 to $150 a barrel. Every dollar the barrel goes up adds about 2.4 cents to a gallon of gas. So you are looking at paying an extra 65 to 75 cents per gallon.
Which adds up incredibly fast.
If you drive an average amount, that is a hidden tax of $420 to $480 a year drained straight out of your pocket.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that localized pain at the pump triggers a catastrophic reaction at the U.S. Federal Reserve. Before this crisis, the market fully expected the Fed to either hold interest rates steady or even cut them to stimulate growth. But a structural supply shock of this magnitude obliterates those plans.
Because you can't print more oil, and you definitely can't fix a paralyzed strait by lowering interest rates.
Precisely the opposite. When the foundational price of energy skyrockets, the cost of moving every single good in the economy goes up with it. It de-anchors inflation completely. The Fed will be backed into a corner where their only tool to stop runaway inflation is a vicious cycle of rate hikes.
They'll have to intentionally kill consumer demand.
Yes. In plain terms, they will have to trigger a recession just to get prices under control.
So what does this all mean for everything else we buy? Because if we're bleeding at the gas pump, how does this bleed into the rest of the supply chain?
The invisible risks here are staggering. It's not just crude oil flowing through that strait. It is the foundational building blocks of the global economy. Iran, for instance, is the third largest exporter of urea in the world.
Hold on. If Iranian petrochemical plants are shut down, couldn't another country just step up their fertilizer production to close the gap? Why does this immediately spell disaster?
Because of the sheer volume of the deficit and the rigid timeline of agriculture. Spring planting is a hard deadline. You can't tell a farmer to wait until October to plant corn. When that Iranian supply vanishes overnight, the global market panics.
And the prices react instantly.
Instantly. Fertilizer prices at New Orleans ports just spiked $50 to $80 a ton almost overnight. When input costs for farmers shoot up right at planting season, it mathematically guarantees that the food prices at your grocery store, specifically anything reliant on wheat, corn, and soy, are going to skyrocket by summer 2026.
It compounds endlessly. It's not just the cost of growing the food or making the goods, it's the physical cost of moving them across the planet. The intelligence dossier outlines this dual chokepoint crisis.
Which is unprecedented.
You have the Red Sea effectively blocked by persistent Houthi attacks, and now Hormuz is paralyzed. Ships are being forced to reroute all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa.
Which adds up to 14 days to the journey. That burns massive amounts of extra fuel and ties up the entire global shipping fleet. Container freight rates are expected to explode. Projections are showing a jump to $5,000 to $7,000 per container.
That's incredible.
Furthermore, the petrochemicals trapped in the Gulf aren't just for fuel or fertilizer. They are the essential feedstocks for global polymers and plastics.
So this disrupts the supply chain for basically everything manufactured.
Everything. From the microchips and resin used in car parts to the plastic packaging keeping your food fresh, all the way down to the sterile, medical-grade plastics used in IV bags at your local hospital. The downstream effects are inescapable.
It's wild to think the global supply chains are this fragile when all the headlines right now are taking absolute victory laps about the military operation itself.
Oh, the media narrative is totally disconnected from reality.
They're acting like those bunker busters solved everything. The narrative is the U.S. dropped the big bombs, the Iranian leadership is decapitated, and the nuclear threat is officially over.
What's fascinating here is how the physical laws of the universe completely dismantle that media narrative. Let's look at the sheer kinetic physics of the weapon they used, the US GBU-57 MOP.
The massive ordnance penetrator.
Right. This is a massive 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb. The specifications are undeniably impressive. It is designed to penetrate about 60 meters of standard dirt or earth before detonating.
Which sounds incredibly deep to a layman. I mean, that's a 20-story building buried underground.
It is a phenomenal feat of engineering. However, the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility at Fordo isn't buried under dirt. It was intentionally built beneath 80 to 90 meters of solid limestone and dolomite rock.
That's a massive difference.
Huge. That specific type of mountain rock has a compressive strength of 25,000 pounds per square inch. It acts like ultra-reinforced concrete created by nature.
But didn't the U.S. military drop multiple bombs into the same crater? The idea being that the first bomb clears a hole and the second bomb goes deeper.
They did, and it is a known tactic. But the intelligence assessments show that kinetic physics still wins. The energy of the sequential blasts simply desiccates out into the massive density of the surrounding mountain. The deepest chambers of Fordo were functionally untouched.
So the centrifuges are still there.
The advanced IR-6 centrifuges survived the strike. The highly enriched nuclear material is still sitting there, completely intact.
That is terrifying. We basically kicked the hornet's nest without actually crushing the stingers. And the documents highlight a secondary, almost entirely ignored radiological risk at the Bushehr nuclear reactor.
Bushehr isn't a weapons enrichment facility, it's a civilian power plant. But in a full-scale kinetic war, it carries a massive radiological risk. If the regional power grid is destroyed by strikes, the reactor relies on backup diesel generators to keep the coolant loops running.
And if those fail?
If those generators fail or run out of fuel, a scenario known in nuclear engineering as a small break loss of coolant accident, the reactor core will melt down. The internal modeling from these sources shows that a radioactive cloud from that kind of failure wouldn't just stay in southern Iran.
It would cross the Gulf.
Exactly. The prevailing winds would blanket the UAE and Kuwait.
Okay, so the nuclear threat is not only alive, it might actually be more volatile now. You know about the conventional retaliation. The headlines covered Operation True Promise 4, where Iran launched ballistic missiles hitting 13 U.S. bases across the Middle East.
Right.
And the human cost was very real. 3 U.S. soldiers were killed in combat at a vital logistics hub in Kuwait.
That is the visible front line, the one made for television. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, those conventional missile strikes are almost a distraction. The asymmetric war is what you aren't seeing, and strategically, it is far more dangerous to the West.
The unseen front lines. Let's look at Europe first, because this detail stood out to me. Hezbollah's External Operations Wing, known as Unit 910, hasn't been sitting idle in the mountains of Lebanon. They've moved their operations directly into major European cities.
Yes, Spanish military intelligence just busted a cell in Barcelona, and they weren't operating out of some hidden bunker.
Right, they were in a standard residential neighborhood, mere blocks away from a synagogue and a local school. The intelligence shows they were actively building suicide drones out of commercial over-the-counter parts.
Because you can't stop a weapons shipment at border control if the weapon is shipped in as civilian hobby electronics, delivered by standard mail, and assembled on a kitchen table in an apartment.
That is the terror of asymmetric warfare. It bypasses conventional defenses entirely. And this threat extends heavily into the digital realm, too. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has issued emergency classified directives regarding Iranian state-backed hackers.
Specifically, a highly capable unit known as APT-34.
And these guys aren't trying to steal your credit card numbers or leak embarrassing emails.
Not at all. They are deploying what is known as wiper malware. The sole purpose of this code is permanent, physical destruction of hardware. They are actively targeting SCADA and ICS systems in the West.
You just said SCADA. I know we try to avoid acronyms here, so what are we actually talking about when we say they're targeting industrial controllers? What does that look like for the average person?
SCADA systems are the literal digital switches that open the physical floodgates at a hydroelectric dam, or route high-voltage electricity to a city's hospital grid, or control the chemical mixture in a municipal water treatment plant.
The stuff that keeps society running.
Exactly. APT-34 is attempting to breach those networks, rewrite the code, and force the machinery to destroy itself over pressurizing pipes or melting down transformers. It is infrastructure terrorism designed to bring daily life to a grinding halt.
Which brings us to perhaps the most misunderstood part of this entire conflict. Over the last few days, you might have seen that Iranian internet connectivity dropped to between 1% and 4%. It is a total digital blackout.
And the Western media immediately ran with the story that the Iranian regime is shutting down the internet to suppress civilian protests and stop videos of unrest from getting out.
Right. But this raises an important question. Why now, at this exact moment? Civilian protests are a persistent factor in Iran, but the counterintelligence data reveals a far more calculated motive.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, isn't just blocking social media. They are using strict network allow listing.
Meaning that the default setting for the entire country's internet is blocked, and you can only connect to pre-approved internal military and government servers.
Exactly the mechanism. The regime realized a horrific truth during Operation Epic Fury. The U.S. and Israeli strikes that killed their top generals were far too precise. The bunker busters might have failed at Fordo, but the targeted assassinations of leadership were flawless.
They knew exactly where they were.
Yes. The IRGC understands that the CIA and Mossad have deeply infiltrated their absolute highest ranks. The coordinates for those generals were leaked from the inside.
So the internet blackout isn't about hiding protests. It's a giant counterintelligence trap. They sealed all the digital exits to hunt down the intelligence moles within their own ranks before those spies could transmit any more target data to the West.
It is a desperate purge. They are trying to blind Western intelligence by locking the country in a digital Faraday cage.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So the leadership is dead, the generals are gone. The obvious question every Western analyst is asking on television right now is, who is number two? Who takes over the Iranian military now that the head has been cut off?
And that is a uniquely Western hierarchical way of thinking. It assumes a rigid top-down chain of command like the Pentagon. But Iranian military doctrine operates on a fundamentally different concept called decentralized mosaic defense.
Mosaic defense. Break that down for us.
Think of a starfish. If you cut off a limb, the limb keeps moving independently. There is no central topping. Number two, waiting for a promotion. The IRGC has 31 regional bases spread across the country.
And they operate independently.
They are explicitly designed, equipped, and programmed by doctrine to fight completely autonomously if the central command in Tehran is destroyed or cut off from communications. The head of the snake is gone, but the body is programmed to keep striking.
So the missile commanders sitting in those underground bunkers don't need a phone call from Tehran to launch a retaliatory strike. By decapitating the leadership, the U.S. hasn't ended the war. They've effectively triggered 31 independent, highly armed, uncontrollable regional wars.
That is the reality of mosaic defense. It trades coordinated strategy for unkillable resilience.
Let's pull back and look at the geopolitical wildcard here, because this conflict does not exist in a vacuum. What happens with China? We know they have massive energy interests in the region.
China is the elephant in the room that no one wants to address. Right now, there's a massive shadow fleet of up to 400 oil tankers operating globally. They sail with their maritime transponders turned off, masking their locations, moving Iranian oil directly to Chinese ports.
And that's crucial for Iran.
China currently buys roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. It is the financial lifeblood of the Iranian economy.
And because the U.S. and Iran are now in an open kinetic conflict under maritime law, that oil is technically considered military contraband funding an enemy combatant.
That is the legal reality. If the U.S. Navy acts on that classification and attempts to board, intercept, or sink those shadow tankers in the open ocean, they aren't just engaging Iranian assets anymore. They are directly seizing fuel destined for the Chinese economy.
Which is a massive escalation.
It risks a direct, immediate naval clash with the Chinese military in the Indo-Pacific.
And the political shockwaves back home in the U.S. are immense. The White House might have expected a classic rally around the flag effect from a decisive military strike, but the data shows the exact opposite reaction from the electorate.
The conservative base in the U.S. is deeply isolationist right now.
Exactly. A prolonged, bloody conflict in the Middle East that sends gas to $5 a gallon and brings home flag-draped coffins will completely devastate the incumbent party ahead of the upcoming midterms.
The political capital to sustain a multi-year, multi-front war simply does not exist in Washington right now. Which brings us to the ultimate unresolved nodes of this crisis. I cannot give you a neat, tidy conclusion today because the raw intelligence doesn't support one.
We're still in the middle of it.
We are. Instead, we have to watch two critical, incredibly volatile questions over the next 48 hours.
What are we watching for?
First, the internal Iranian vote. The Iranian parliament is pushing aggressively to physically mine the Strait of Hormuz, dropping naval mines to permanently destroy any ship trying to pass. But that requires final approval from their Supreme National Security Council.
Which is still debating.
Right now, there is a fierce battle behind closed doors. Will the pragmatists win, keeping the strait somewhat navigable to ensure Chinese money keeps flowing? Or will the radical military wing win, invoking a Samson option to bring the entire global economy down with them in a final act of vengeance? We don't know the answer yet.
In the second unresolved node,
The 60% enriched uranium sitting at Fordo. As we established, the bunker busters didn't destroy it. If the Iranian government structure entirely collapses under the weight of this war and those 31 regional commands turn on each other, who secures the nuclear material?
that leads perfectly into the final chilling frame shift we need to leave you with today. The entire Western media, the politicians, the pundits, they're all acting terrified of a strong, vengeful Iran starting World War III. But the intelligence suggests that is the entirely wrong framework.
It's looking at the wrong threat entirely.
The true nightmare scenario, the one the White House seems completely blind to, is Iran becoming a failed state. If this strategy of decapitation works too well, and the government completely collapses into a power vacuum, you do not get a neat, peaceful transition to a Western democracy.
No, you get a massive nation of 90 million people fracturing into a chaotic, multi-faction civil war.
Suddenly, you have unsecured, highly enriched nuclear material entering the global black market, available to any terror syndicate with enough cash. And you have an estimated 15 million refugees flooding across the borders into Europe and Turkey, completely breaking the back of the global asylum and welfare systems.
A controlled, predictable conflict with a hostile dictatorship is vastly less destructive to the world than the chaotic, violent collapse of a massive nation.
But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over something outside the immediate fallout in the Middle East. We just discussed how U.S. and Israeli intelligence managed to infiltrate the IRGC so deeply that they could flawlessly target their top generals overnight.
The intelligence purge.
Right. If you are sitting in Moscow or Beijing watching this unfold, What does that level of Western infiltration do to your psyche? Are we about to see massive paranoid intelligence purges within the Russian and Chinese militaries as they realize just how vulnerable their own ranks might be? The old framework for understanding global security no longer applies. Keep your eyes open. The ground is shifting under our feet.